With us now is Chris Farrell with Judicial Watch. A pleasure to have you on the show, sir.
Great to be on with you. Thank you.
It is said that Judicial Watch is doing so much to protect the rights of American citizens who are unfortunately, allegedly subjected to abuse by the IRS and alleged fraud by the IRS. What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, we're a watchdog organization, and our objective is to provide the public with information. Principally, the idea behind it really is to promote transparency, integrity, and accountability in government politics and the law. And we've done so by very aggressive use of the Open Records Law, the Freedom of Information Act here in the United States. And so that law allows us to ask the government for records and documents, and then we use those materials to educate the public about what the government is doing. And that's really the thrust of what we do.
Judicial Watch has been the leading institution for transparency and accountability in Washington for over 20 years, and you have actually been heavily involved in exposing the IRS's political targeting of Tea Party and other nonprofit 501c3 and 501c4 organizations through the Freedom of Information Act, otherwise known as FOIA.
Right.
Tell us about what you learned from the 906 pages of Lois Lerner's documents.
Yeah, so there was a decision in the Obama White House, probably at the sort of the Valerie Jarrett ring of influence, right? You can't tie it directly into the president in the Oval Office, but at a very senior, very high level, there was a decision made in the Obama White House to essentially weaponize the IRS. This is the sort of stuff that would make Richard Nixon blush, right? Nixon only talked about auditing people as a weapon. The Obama administration actively went after people and used the IRS as a political weapon. And they used an operative, a Democratic Party operative by the name of Lois Lerner, who for decades had been in government service. She's an attorney. She had started out in the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, years ago in the 1990s, and would act. Her first loyalty apparently was to the party, not to the Constitution. And so within the FEC, she acted as a Democratic Party operative. Later at the IRS, she went after and targeted so-called Tea Party groups or patriot groups or any of the sort of activists on the right, and used the power of the IRS to suppress and go after different groups. And our documentation shows that. She suggested meetings with the Department of Justice to criminally prosecute people just to see if they could do it, just to see if they could get away with it. I mean, this is startling material. Another instance, we obtained documents where it showed that the IRS provided 1.25 million taxpayer records to the FBI just so they could sort of screen through them to find something that they might wish to prosecute. It's prohibited by law. You can't share taxpayer information that way. And we documented that they did it.
Absolutely astonishing. In one of your Freedom of Information Act lawsuits, in particular for emails between August and November of 2012 that included potential political terms, the IRS claimed that responding could implicate up to 2,200 employees, and it could take them many years to respond. How has the IRS been responding to your claim against them, your lawsuit?
Yeah. So the Open Records Law, the process is you file a letter with a particular agency asking for documents. It's an administrative process initially, and you have to exhaust all of your administrative remedies in asking and then kind of pushing the agency to give you the records you seek. When that fails, your final remedy is a lawsuit. And so in this case, of course, the IRS dragged their feet, right? They weren't terribly interested in answering our questions or providing us with documents. So eventually we filed a lawsuit here in federal court, and we sought the court to compel the agency to produce records. And they started to, but they did so at really a glacial pace. Very tedious, slow process. And they destroyed records along the way. And then sort of further adding complication to the whole process, is the government is very good at inventing reasons to slow down. And one of the ways they do that is say, well, we know that you have a lawsuit going, but we've started our own internal investigation, and we have to carry that out first, right? Which sounds good. Oh, you're investigating yourself? You have an inspector general involved? That sounds marvelous, but really it's a dodge, right? It's another attempt to slow walk and delay, and all the time they're doing that, the American public is left out just guessing or wondering what happened. And that's the technique that they employed.
There are so many dodgers in politics and unfortunately with government institutions. In your opinion, how many nonprofits were actually negatively impacted by the IRS targeting both directly and indirectly targeting communities, and how many of these are still waiting for an answer on their application?
Yeah. And just recently there was some documentation released that showed that at a minimum about 450 different groups were really hung up. But I don't think that's even a fair estimate, because those are the people who are sort of most egregiously effective. The total number probably goes into over 1,000, maybe 1,200 different groups. And the reason I say that is because the IRS didn't necessarily aggressively go after every single group, but they would sort of engage in benign neglect, right? They would fail to act. It isn't as though they targeted and went after every single group. They did in some instances, where they would send investigators out or send demands for documentation, sort of an aggressive affirmative investigation. In other instances, there was just a void, right? There was a silence where a group was trying to organize and get their tax-exempt status so they could raise money, organize, conduct activities. Instead, they were left with their response was a non-response, right? Which left them in sort of limbo. They didn't know where they stood legally. And that was another technique or another way in which the IRS, they wouldn't affirmatively go after an organization, but they would leave them in this sort of never-never land where it wasn't clear what their status was.
The media has focused on targeting during the nonprofit application process, but we know that isn't where the intimidation ended, is it?
No, not at all. I mean, in some instances you'd have IRS agents come to people's workplace, to their homes. They would submit requests for essentially written interrogatories. They would ask people to justify what they did and how they operated. They'd ask them, I think one of the most outrageous things is there was one organization that a large component of their organizing principle was there was a religious component to how they operated. It was a faith-based organization. And the IRS went so far as to ask them what they prayed for. Because part of what they said was, well, we engage in a ministry, we engage in political activism, we engage in community outreach, all these different activities that the group was involved in. But instead of just saying, oh, okay, these are the areas in which you operate, this is part of your advocacy, they went so far as to ask them the subject matter that they prayed about, which is an extraordinarily offensive invasion of privacy. It's no one's business what someone prays about or for. If they have a goal or a listed set of objectives, that's one thing. But asking people what they pray about, that's the lengths they went to. It's outrageous.
I believe you are familiar with Lori Lowenthal Marcus, who has Z Street, an organization that is very much pro-Israel. And she and her organization have been targeted. What's your view with regard to how the IRS seems to make unilateral decisions to target one group that they are less pleased with as opposed to those that they are?
Yeah, well, this is part of the political weaponizing of the IRS, right? So the administration, the Obama administration, has their favorites. They enjoy picking winners and losers. That's part of, it's not an even playing field, right? And so those persons that are ideologically or politically not allied with the administration find themselves subject to extra scrutiny. And with an election coming up in 2012, the objective of the administration was to tie up those groups legally and through the tax code, to tie them up in knots so that they couldn't organize and effectively communicate or engage in advocacy and essentially suppress the opposition, right? So that if you weren't allied with the administration, and it could be on any number of issues. It could be on abortion, it could be on guns, it could be on foreign policy, any number of different issues where people will agree or disagree, and that's fine, you can agree or disagree, but not with this administration. If you disagreed with them, they put the IRS in a position to suppress your activities, to lower your ability to conduct your normal operation, to intimidate your membership. So the people thought, well, you know, I kind of like this group, I agree with what they're trying to do, but if I give them money, if I contribute to them, or if I show up at a conference, or if I go to a rally, will I be targeted? Will the IRS come after me? And that's exactly what they wanted to do. They wanted to put that question mark not just over the organizations or institutions, but they sought to actively suppress individual voters, individual advocates from participating in the political process. And the way you do that is to scare them. And so if you think, well, if I write a check for $25, $100, $1,000, whatever you choose to support a particular group, does that now mean that I'm a target? Will they get that donor list? That's scary stuff. That is very intimidating.
Certainly is. Back to Z Street.
Sure.
Do you believe that was an isolated incident, or?
No, I think Z Street, I'm not intimately familiar with the case. I know that they were part of this targeting. But Z Street and any other number of groups were subjected to exactly what I've been talking about, this kind of attempt to suppress, intimidate, manipulate, not just the organization, but also those persons that would support them, either financially or through any number of things, letter writing, participation in conferences or rallies, or all kinds of things that people who would normally be active in a group, Z Street and others like them, were subjected to this kind of really political weaponizing of a government agency.
Do you believe there's a tendency for the current administration to single out organizations that support Israel specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think this administration certainly has not been a friend to Israel. At best, they have this very sort of confused, ambiguous position where they talk and say one thing but act another way. And I think that they don't respond well to sort of activism or pressure. We saw how Mr. Obama treated your prime minister. I mean, I think that speaks volumes, right? The litmus test in politics is not necessarily what a politician says, but what they do. And I think you simply need to examine actions and behavior and conduct, and that's where you find the truth.
Truth, a rare commodity in this world.
Very.
With regard to specific cases, Mr. Wayne Allen Root was subjected to an audit of his 2007-2008 returns by the IRS,
Yep.
who assessed a deficiency of nearly $70,000 against him, for which he appealed to the U.S. tax court. The tax court overturned the IRS ruling. And I'd like to ask you what your views are on that.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Root, again, is an outspoken libertarian politician. I think my recollection is he ran for vice president on a libertarian ticket one election cycle back. But he's always been a very outspoken guy, another activist, another guy who thinks less government, lower taxes, individual freedom. These are the things that I think that are a fair characterization of what he supports. And they are really sort of polar opposite of what the administration, the Obama administration, is all about. And he's an outspoken person, and so guess what? Outspoken people get extraordinary attention.
And Judicial Watch sued the IRS on this case.
We did, because we had asked for records and documentation on his behalf, and they did everything they could to kind of jerk him around and not be responsive. And so we tried to obtain, records and documentation for him. We were ultimately successful, but it takes, what the sad thing is, it takes a federal lawsuit to get their attention, right? To have them comply with the law. And that's a frustrating thing.
It took more than a year to get those documents regarding the root case.
Yeah, I mean, it's not unusual. I mean, our experience with the open records law is, the government's first response is no, and then the second response is wait, right? And that's why we spend so much time. There is no one in the United States who does more Freedom of Information Act litigation than Judicial Watch. The next three organizations combined don't equal what we do. And when I say the next three organizations, I'm talking about very large FOIA operations, people that use the law, things like the American Civil Liberties Union, the National Security Archive, large, very sophisticated organizations that have tremendous backing and awareness publicly, but no one comes close to what we do.
On our program, we maintain an impartial attitude. We listen to both sides. Mr. Farrell, tell us, for our audience, more about Judicial Watch and your role in this organization.
Sure. So I mentioned earlier, we're a watchdog organization. We've been around now for over 20 years, coming up on 22 years. I've been with the organization 17 of those years. We have a staff of just under 50. I think it's about 46 or 47 folks now. Most of our people are here in Washington, D.C. We have a small office in Florida and a small office in California. We rely upon individual donations. We're truly a grassroots organization. There's no big donor writing checks to us to keep us afloat, right? There's no secret person pulling the strings. There's no George Soros. There's no Koch brothers. That's not how we operate. It is literally a grassroots operation. We have something like just shy of 500,000 people in the country who write checks to us every month. They support our work. The way that sort of the business process of it is, we publish a newsletter called The Verdict every month. It's actual real hard copy print. We also post it on our website. And then we say, look, if you like our work, if you like what we're doing, you think it's important, then please support us financially. We're organized, speaking of the IRS, we're organized as a 501c3, as an educational foundation under the law. So donations to us are tax deductible for people who wish to support us. And look, we've been audited by the IRS. So this is not some academic discussion. We faced our own IRS audit years ago. It was initiated under President Clinton. And they went over our records, with scrupulous detail. And I'm very proud to say, when they finished the audit, there was not one finding against us, not one. And you and I both know that if they want to have a finding, they can say, oh, you signed this form in blue ink. The regulation says black ink, right? If they want to create a finding, they can, not one. So I'm quite proud of that, because we've been put through the mill and we came out on the other end of it and, clean, because there's nothing to find. So we're very sensitive to this IRS issue, because we've been on the pointy end of the stick there. We understand what it's like.
And other organizations that should be scrutinized aren't.
No, I mean, there's organizations, I'll give you a great example. There was something called ACORN, right, which is sort of a leftist political agitation, community organizing operation, something Mr. Obama would be very familiar with. And ACORN engaged in massive fraud. 17 state attorneys general prosecuted something like 70 ACORN members, went after them for various misconduct, fraud, etc. Many convictions. And an operation like that simply changed its letterhead, right? So now it isn't ACORN, now it's Community Action Group, or some other sort of, name that sounds familiar. In many instances, they didn't even change their tax ID number. The same board of directors became the new board of directors. They didn't move, literally, they just changed their letterhead. And so there's organizations like that which really would require tremendous scrutiny. There's organizations, I'll give you another one, in my personal opinion, an organization like CARE, right? The Council of American Islamic Relations. There's an organization that might deserve additional scrutiny. They have very questionable contacts and organizations and persons involved in their operations. Many people who are very knowledgeable in the subject consider them essentially the public affairs arm, the smiley face of Hamas, right? So there's organizations that operate that may deserve additional scrutiny that don't get it. And other groups that really simply are just trying to exercise their ordinary civil rights as citizens. If they're on the wrong side of Mr. Obama, they get extra scrutiny.
From your point of view, what changes would you advocate for this country and the IRS?
Well, the IRS, I think one of the greatest disappointments there is that with all of this scandal and with someone who's sort of almost like a piñata, like Lois Lerner, right? She's the face of IRS arrogance, really. Or the commissioner, Mr. Koskinen. Look, the Department of Justice and the FBI said that they weren't going to prosecute anybody. Everybody gets a pass. That is horrendous. That is an abuse of the IRS, of our justice system. All this documentation of misconduct and really using the organization as a political weapon, and not a single person was held to account. That is a travesty. That needs to be cleaned up. The Commissioner Koskinen, another very sort of disconnected, arrogant fellow, if you watch his testimony in front of Congress, there was some move to perhaps even impeach him, because you can impeach lesser officers, constitutional officers. Now they're saying, well, maybe the Congress is discussing, maybe we'll withhold his pay. The guy is a multimillionaire to begin with. He doesn't care about his paycheck. He's a political operative installed to conduct certain activities. But really the shame is that everybody walked and there's no prosecutions. That's what needs to be fixed.
So much needs to be fixed. I want to thank you so much for being with us today. It's a real pleasure.